the fact that they've talked about that allegedly, we're trying to pass a lot of what has been described in these talks. I think that's a sign of the lack of Russian seriousness in terms of their interest in either a ceasefire
Mm.
or a broader peace deal as things are.
Because Putin knows the answer has to be no.
He knows the answer has to be.
The fighting goes on and on in Ukraine. We see Russia now occupying most of the Lugansk region, over half of the heavily fortified Donetsk Oblast. Putin wants that area so much. And the Russian Ministry of Defense claims full control of 3 new settlements, while the clashes continue around the key battlefields of Pokrovsk, Kupiansk and Liman. Well, as Putin makes these gains, I spoke to the Lithuanian defense minister earlier and asked what might force Putin to the table.
The only thing that Russia understands is pressure. So supplying Ukraine using United States weapons or anything that we can get, making Ukrainian army as strong as we can. Secondly, pressuring Russia through sanctions. If they don't feel pain, they are not going to stop. Why should they? They are moving slowly for for 4th year in a row, but we are still moving. Number 3, I think also not falling into the trap of false narrative by Russia. I mean, saying that Putin wants peace is a bit paradox, isn't it? I mean, if you want to stop beating your neighbor, you can just, lower your fist, and that's what it takes.
The Lithuanian Defence Minister there. Now we're joined by Matthew Savill, the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, welcome to the programme.
Good afternoon.
Matthew, just give us a sense, as clear as you can, on the state of things in the war, on the battlefield. Putin is very clearly stalling because he wants to continue to attack in Ukraine. Can it be said, in your judgment, Russia is now, at this stage, winning the war? And that position by Putin makes, in pure military terms, makes sense.
Russia has momentum, and if you looked overall at the war, and particularly on the ground, it has a number of advantages in terms of sheer mass, in military industrial capacity, people, and some equipment. So I suppose you would say it's the one that's going forwards, and it is the Ukrainian position that is deteriorating. But it hasn't achieved its overall objectives yet, and it is some way from doing that. And so I think, whilst we should be concerned about the Ukrainian position, there is still agency in terms of Ukraine's international backers, in terms of what they can do to support Ukraine. I mean, essentially, the Russians are following an attritional approach. They are happy to take that extraordinary cost, which we can talk about for the time being, but they will face increasing pressure throughout this year, probably now into next year. I think the thing that has changed is that we would have said the Russians would have been in trouble towards the end of 2025. It now looks like they can probably keep going into 2026.
Right, and how does that compare to the relative position of Ukraine and Ukrainian forces? I mean, clearly, Zelensky wants a ceasefire for clear reasons, just for some respite. The people of Ukraine need some sort of respite. But on the battlefield, who's to gain most from the continuation of the war? As you say, Putin, not so badly off at the moment, but his resources are being exhausted.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to answer that question in terms of both sides, because a lot of it depends on what you think will happen if, I'm a bit skeptical about a cessation of violence. We can come back to that. Because if the line were frozen where it is now, and that were the end of it, I think neither Russia nor Ukraine would be satisfied with that as a permanent holding place. If it were a temporary pause, I think the Ukrainians would be glad for the respite. I mean, what's mostly happening on the ground at the moment is that the Ukrainians are thinly stretched over a number of parts of the front line. They have maybe a dozen people covering very wide frontages of several kilometers in small isolated positions. And the Russians are probing with their own infantry, largely dismounted from vehicles, trying to find weak spots and get through. It does mean the front line has become increasingly blurred. So it's quite hard for us to work out where the front is in some places.
Well, now talk to me about the Donbas region. And one of the ideas that Putin, we're told, floated the other day with President Trump was just being given the Donbas in its entirety, even though large parts of it are still in Ukrainian hands. And Russia has suffered heavy losses taking that part of that region that it has so far. To get the whole thing would be enormously costly to Russia, wouldn't it, in terms of personnel and equipment?
Yes, at the rate of progress at which they've been going, which has picked up in July and August and is, hundreds of square kilometres a week. UK Defence Intelligence recently assessed it would take them over 4 years to capture the rest of all 4 of the oblasts that they're focusing on. So that includes Kherson and Zaporizhia, but it would still take a couple of years to get the rest of Donetsk. My caution there is, of course, is if the Ukrainian lines began to crumple, they might be forced to withdraw quite rapidly.
Yeah.
So that's not that isn't a straight line progress. But the point is, it's been incredibly bloody and expensive. Yeah. The reason that is the focus is partly because it's those 2 bits, particularly that make up the Donbas, where you had the highest proportion of Russian speakers. It's also because it's where the strongest current Ukrainian fortifications, their so-called fortress belt, lies, and that's Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinivka. And if those are given away, the terrain beyond it is a bit flatter, it's a bit easier, and suddenly places like Lyman and into Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk become a lot more vulnerable.
Right, and that's an important point, isn't it? Because if Putin was allowed to, was just given these areas militarily so advantageous, it's a fortress of an area, he would just move forward. He'd station forces and troops and equipment in that area that he'd just been given, and be in so much stronger a position for a future push to take more of Ukraine.
Yes, and if you're honest, I think the fact that they've talked about that, allegedly, we're trying to pass a lot of what has been described in these talks. I think that's a sign of the lack of Russian seriousness in terms of their interest in either a ceasefire or a broader peace deal as things are.
Because Putin knows the answer has to be no.
He knows the answer has to be. I mean, that'd be politically incredibly difficult. I mean, the pre-war population of that area was between 300 and 400,000. A lot of those people have left already. They would almost certainly want to avoid Russian occupation and would leave. This would be a huge ask for the Ukrainians. And you've got to imagine that actually that is being proposed because the Russians hope the Ukrainians will predictably reject it, and then they could blame the Ukrainians for the collapse of talks. And I think I'm a bit skeptical about all of the discussion around security guarantees and what that actually amounts to. But one of the successes of this week has been that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have avoided so far being seen to be the ones who are blocking talks.
Yeah. Okay, now you say you're skeptical. I want to move on to that. Skeptical about the idea of the coalition of the willing force, the reassurance for some sort of multinational force to guard a ceasefire when and if a peace ever comes. You're skeptical. Tell me what you're skeptical about. We hear Donald Trump being very reticent to commit very much by way of support for a multinational force on the ground in Ukraine. And even among those members, there's no very great degree of clarity on what individual countries would be willing to commit. Is this whole project, is there less to it than meets the eye, not that very much does meet the eye?
Yeah, I think it's a natural and understandable attempt to demonstrate to the US in particular, and to reassure the Ukrainians that Europe is prepared to get involved. But the challenge is, having apparently decided that there wasn't the political will to take risks, and it would have been a significant risk to deploy forces in, if you like, to deter Russia, to be prepared to necessarily fight it, it all hinges on there being a ceasefire and there being some kind of US support to enable them to sustain themselves in country. So the 2 problems are, 1, they're waiting for a ceasefire that may never come. And 2, they have made it a hostage to fortune in terms of there being a obvious and credible offer of US support. And the US is now talking about providing some kind of support. That's much more likely to be intelligence and logistics. But it does mean that this is not really a deterrent force. It is potentially useful to helping the Ukrainians build themselves back up in the interim and be themselves much more capable. But that is not something that is going to, in and of itself, worry or scare the Russians in terms of a European presence. So that is the problem.
All right. Well, great to get your expert view there, Matthew. Matthew Savill from RUSI.